this is recorded on our Dorothy Maritime Museum YouTube channel. All right. So good evening, everybody. Welcome to our December presentation of the 2021-2022 Dorothy Maritime Museum Speaker Series. Thank you to our sponsor, Dorothy Medical Center. For those of you who are watching online, please make sure you keep your video off to assist with our bandwidth, and your microphone's muted. Same thing, everybody in the museum, check your phone, make sure you're silenced, please. Please hold your questions to the end. Dr. Jung will leave plenty of time for questions. Same thing with online. Anybody who has questions online, please type them into the chat, and Brennan, who is over there moderating, will ask them at the end of our presentation. So we're gathered here tonight, December 2nd, 2021, to learn or maybe have some light shed on some of our local history, our local explorers. Tonight's presenter, Dr. Patrick Jung, comes to us from the Milwaukee School of Engineering, and he's going to address maybe the true relationship with Jean Nicolet and Jacques Marquette and the first American tribe of Puans. Without further ado, Dr. Jung.
Of course, thanks to Iroquois Maritime Museum. As I say, I first met Brennan, I think it was over the summer, and I've been kind of working with the museum on some of their exhibits and everything else. He and I had a great conversation. He's just written an excellent article on Death's Door, which I gave him some feedback on. I'm looking forward to reading that when it's published. All right. Well, first of all, let me explain who I am and the kind of research I've done. I've written 2 books on Jean Nicolet and 1 book on Jacques Marquette. The book for Jacques Marquette, it was actually published by the Richfield Historical Society in Richfield, Wisconsin. It didn't take very long to write this. They just wanted to know if Father Marquette had ever gone to Holy Hill down in Washington County. Of course, he hadn't, but I had to go into 40-something pages to explain how this myth even rose up and why he had never been there. And my 2 books on Nicolet, I wrote the first one with the late Nancy Osterreich-Lurie, who was an anthropologist at the Milwaukee Public Museum. I came to disagree with much of what I had written with her and came to write my own book, The Misunderstood Mission of Jean Nicolet. That just came out in 2018. It's available to the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. But let me explain. I know a lot more about Nicolet than I do Marquette, but Marquette is a lot easier to research. Let me just kind of go into a couple of things. We know more about Marquette than we will ever know about Jean Nicolet. Written on Nicolet because we have a lot of disagreements and going back and forth over the years. Nicolet was here in the Green Bay area in either 1633 or 1634. Can't even be 100% sure of the year. In my 2 books, I went with 1634 as the most likely of the 2 dates, but I also made it clear that that's the most likely of the dates, not definite. Now, Jacques Marquette, we know for a fact, passed within about 50 yards of here on October 31st, 1674. That's a big difference. We're not exactly sure when Nicolet was here. We're not exactly sure where he went. The best we can do is talk in possibilities and probabilities. But we can say, sure as the sun's going to rise in the east, Jacques Marquette passed right by here, probably within 50 yards of where I was standing, October 31st, 1674. We know, and this is basically how historical research works. We know a lot more about some things than we do about other things. And it's the things that we know less about where there's the most amount of debate. Now, the next thing I wanted to say here is this. This is absolutely crucial that everybody knows this. These are all the people whose works I read on Nicolet. I'm going to talk more about Nicolet and Marquette. But long before I did my research, there were other people who had researched the life and the explorations of Jean Nicolet. Now, why do I go to great length? This is not even everybody. through just a, what, dozen people I could fit, on a slide. There's a lot of people I'm not even mentioning here. Most of them are historians. Some of them are, others are archaeologists. Others are cultural anthropologists. As you can see, they go back a long way, and there's some people here from the present day. And these are people who I've engaged with in debates about not just Jean Nicolet, but about the native people he met. Even the people who died long before I was born, like John Gilmarie Shea. Essentially, every time I read something he wrote, every time I referenced something that he produced, I was essentially engaged in a long-ranging generational conversation with a dead scholar. Now, I say this because at my last two talks I gave, I was heckled by people who basically thought I was just making things up, that this is all just whim and fancy, that, I just kind of wrote when I felt like writing. I just woke up one morning and said, you know what, I'm going to just say that Jean Nicolet went to Marinette because I like Marinette more than Sturgeon Bay or Red Banks. It's a little bit more complicated than that. History is a discipline. It's got a set of very exacting methods. You basically have to look at what everybody else said before you, what other scholars are saying in the present day. You have to bounce your ideas off of one another. Everything has to go through peer review. Peer review is a brutal process. I've been through it many times. Feel like you're an inch tall after someone has read what you've written and provided feedback. And you don't know who they are. It's called blind peer review. And you're not going to get something published unless it gets through blind peer review. You have to convince other scholars who have done similar research who are correct. So I want you to understand, my work rests on the shoulders of a lot of other people, and their research rests on the shoulders of other researchers. This is something that is, that takes years and years and years of research and writing and feedback and peer review. It's a very exacting process. But I'm going to start with Jean Nicolet. I'm going to tell you how little we know about him and what most likely we do know that is correct and things that we know are wrong. First of all, I'm not going to bore you to death with all the details. If you really want to get bored to death, you can buy this book on Amazon. Okay. As I say, I don't bring books to sell. It's cheaper actually to get them on Amazon than to buy them from me. So, if you really want one, that's what I would recommend. But first of all, Nicolet was a translator. He worked, he was one of the first French people in North America. He worked for Samuel de Champlain, who was the commander of the colony of New France. He wasn't technically the governor, he was the commander. Champlain was in charge of the French colony, which had its headquarters in Quebec. And there were many people like Nicolet who served as translators with native people. Now, we have no idea what either one of these men looked like. What you're looking at, this is the Nicolet statue that I'm sure you've all seen as you drive down 57. You've seen the statue. Okay, well, I don't know if that's what he looked like. Nobody does. We don't know what Champlain looked like either. That was that engraving in 1867. There was a French-Canadian engraver who took a picture of an Italian guy, made a few changes. Voila! So again, there's a lot we don't know. We have no idea what they really look like. These are just two of the more common images. So keep in mind the relationship. Champlain is in charge of the colony of New France. Its economy is based upon the fur trades of the in order to make that fur trade work, you need people like Jean Nicolet, who was a very young boy, probably about 18 or 19 years of age, live among the native and learn their languages, spoke several Indian languages fluently, and to facilitate trade between the French and the native. Now let's kind of talk about what we do and don't know about Nicolet. There's Nicolet everything around here. And trying to figure out who he was and what he did. As I say, this has been a debate among historians and scholars now for going on, well over 100 years into the 1850s. This whole scholarly debate. Now, most of what I've written here, not most, but a big chunk of what I wrote, actually rests upon the work of two earlier scholars. Um, Conrad Heidenreich, who's a retired historical geographer in Canada, and Nancy Oestreich-Lurie. Again, it was Nancy Oestreich-Lurie of the Milwaukee Public Museum that I wrote my first book on Nicolet. I should say it was really her book. She had the vision for it. She brought me on board. She was an anthropologist who kind of understood historical research, but she wasn't real confident. I was a historian, good at historical research, and I dabble in anthropology. So we were able to kind of fill in each other's gaps along the way. But Heidenreich's works came first. He spent his career researching the maps and the cartography of Samuel de Champlain. And Champlain's writings can be very cryptic. His maps were good, but they don't look accurate when you first look at them, because a lot of what he was doing was speculation based upon other people's explorations or information that he received native people. But Conrad Heidenreich was absolutely correct in the 1970s when he surmised that if you're going to figure out where Jean Nicolet went, you first have to understand the writings of Champlain. Nicolet wrote nothing down. It's nothing that survives. Everything we know about Jean Nicolet was written by other people. Champlain doesn't mention him at all in any of his writings, which isn't unusual. He didn't mention a lot of people. But Conrad Heidenreich was correct that if we're going to understand where Nicolet went, we first really have to understand the writings of Champlain, who was the only Frenchman of his time who explained North American geography and what the French knew of it in any detail. Heidenreich basically did a lot of my work for me when he published this book in 1976, when I was 12 years old. Okay? So I owe him a great debt. He's retired now. I've talked to him a few times. He's a brilliant scholar during his career. Nancy began researching Nicolet in the 1950s, before I was even born. She was one of the foremost anthropologists who worked with and studied the Ho-Chunk people of Wisconsin. And of course, the first European to meet the ancestors of the Ho-Chunk was Jean Nicolet. We know that. In my mind, there's absolutely no doubt about that. Well, she was right to understand that we would understand more about the earliest Ho-Chunk ancestors of the Ho-Chunk if we could understand as much as we could about the first Frenchmen to have contact with. So she began this research in the late 1950s. She kind of continued it off and on throughout her career. Then in 2005, she invited me on to a book project, which I very happy to be part of. And she determined that much of what earlier historians had written about Nicolet was wrong. And she was right to understand that if we could correct mistakes about Nicolet, we could have a better understanding of the native people who we met. We could understand one half of this meeting, between the first Frenchmen and the earliest native people in Wisconsin. If we could correct the errors in one, we'd have a clearer picture of the other. And again, she spent well over 50 years engaged in a lot of that research. It was her book. She had the final say in everything. I wrote one chapter and part of another. I also helped with editing and getting images and everything else. As I said, she was a cultural anthropologist who was a pretty good historical researcher, but there was a lot of things she didn't understand how to find. I helped her with that. I was a historian who dabbles in anthropology, so I was able to know what she looked for. And again, within a couple of years of writing it, I realized after I continued to do research, she kind of stopped after that because she had other things she wanted. She only died about 4 years ago. But it was clear that some of what she had written, I just came to slowly not agree with. And that's okay. I know if I could bring Nancy here right now and explain to her why I disagree with what she wrote, we would have a good debate, and eventually she and I would probably, come to some sort of consensus. We might still disagree about this. And that's the way it's supposed to be. Good debate, respectful disagreement. But one of the things I found out is she really was using older archaeology. I continue to talk to archaeologists to try to get the most recent archaeological work that's being done. And it was clear that what archaeologists were saying about native contact Wisconsin just didn't jive with what Nancy was. And again, I think if I could bring her back here and have a long conversation with her over a glass of wine, eventually I'd like to think she had a strong will, and I smile every time I think about it. So anyway, so those are the two people who really kind of set the stage for me. And there were other researchers who had set the stage for them. This is a long conversation over generations between scholars about what actually happened in the past. Again, it's a very exacting, disciplined set of methods. Well, everything we know about Nicolet comes from the writings of two French Jesuits. Now, Nicolet was literate, and he probably did write some sort of report that was lost. But at least parts of that report were preserved by two French Jesuits. Paul Lejeune, know what he looked like. We have one engraving of him. And the other was Barthélemy Vimont. We have no idea what he looks like. But every year, what the Jesuits would do during their time in North America, they would go out among native people, oftentimes deep into the heart of North America, and they would write annual reports that they would send back to Quebec. All of those would be compiled into a single report called a relation. They would be sent off to Paris, and they would be published. So the Jesuit relations, as they're known, and you can see two of the covers there, one by Vimont, the other one. They both say Vimont, although Lejeune helped write part of another one. Luckily, back about 100 years ago, a little over 100 years ago, one of the historians whose picture I showed you before found all 72 volumes, or all the different relations, mostly in French libraries, and had them republished and translated. And I have all 72 of those volumes on my computer. If anybody wants them, let me know. I'll pull out my external hard drive. So again, before that happened, it was almost impossible to understand what the Jesuits wrote because their books were just collecting dust on obscure bookshelves in France. One guy, Reuben Goldthwait, pulled all of them together, collected them, took years to do it, translated them, and published them. And now they're available electronically. I have more electronic. Okay, so as I said, the writings of these two Jesuits provide most of what we know about Nicolet's journey. Now, as I said, Champlain never mentions Nicolet once in his writings, but he did mention most of the translators who worked for him. But nevertheless, Heidenreich believed that Champlain's writings would in part clear up the answer of where Nicolet went. Now, these are all the proposed landfalls that Jean Nicolet made. He only went one place, but the references that Vimont and Lejeune wrote down are very vague. And over the course of many years, going all the way back to John Gilles-Marichet in the 1850s, these are all proposed locations for where Nicolet went. All right. Again, many of those earlier scholars who I had pictures of, some of these were proposed by them. But again, none of them really went and looked at Champlain's writings and his maps as thoroughly as Conrad Heidenreich. And Heidenreich, if you read his writings, he makes it clear that Jean Nicolet came into Lake Michigan by the Strait of Mackinac and almost certainly went up the west coast of the western shore of Green Bay. Heidenreich never really was too concerned about where Nicolet went. He basically said he went somewhere along the western shore of Green Bay. Where he went, we don't know. Ultimately, Nancy Lurie, when I was working with her, she said the most likely place that Nicolet went was Marinette. Now, just to kind of give you, if you like numbers, let me just kind of give you possibilities and probabilities. And again, this is years of thinking about this. I am 90% certain that Heidenreich is right. That Nicolet basically went along the western shore of Green Bay and landed somewhere along there. 90%. I am 30 to 40% certain that he probably went to Marinette. It's the best possible location where he could have gone, based upon very, very vague evidence. And that was Nancy Lurie's guess, that he probably went to Marinette. You can't be 100% sure of any of it, but those are probably the best answers we're going to find. Now, again, today there are two different historical markers in Wisconsin alone. They're about within an hour of one another. There are There's one at Green Bay. How many of you seen this one here in here at Green Bay? This is the one at Red Banks. Then there's one in Menasha on Doty Island. Why are there two different historical markers? Well, this kind of, you have to understand why some arguments are made. The person who said he went to Red Banks was Arthur Neville, who just happened to be the mayor of Green Bay, and he had a vested interest in trying to get Nicolets land as close to Green Bay as he could. He thought that was just, the first white man in Wisconsin, and the best argument in his mind was Red Banks. Publius Lawson was the mayor of Menasha, and of course he vehemently disagreed. Neville was a Republican, Lawson was a Democrat, and they both raised money for their pet theories. That's why, we also have one in Menasha. The problem is they're both wrong. Okay. Now, one thing that Nancy and I determined after 4 years of working on this question, coming up with the right answer is probably impossible. Like I said, we can probably just kind of come up with probabilities. 90% certain that he landed somewhere in the west shore of Green Bay, 30 to 40% that he went to Marinette. But we can eliminate wrong answers 100%. And both of those are 100% wrong. Okay. And one thing we found out, it was a lot easier to eliminate wrong answers. And we figured, well, let's at least do that. If we can't do anything else, we'll just eliminate wrong answers. And I'll say this about Neville and Lawson. They were both fairly competent historical researchers. But they're like a lot of people who, they were amateur historians. They weren't academic historians. They looked for the answer they wanted to find. And lo and behold, they found it. Okay. Nancy and I wanted to find the best answer, and we had no ties to the Marinette Chamber of Commerce or anything else. Okay, just thought that was the best answer, but we also prefaced it with this is the best answer, not the only answer. Now, Nancy was far better plugged into the archaeology and Indian world traditions than any of the earlier researchers. And as I said, she relying heavily upon the French sources. They're very vague. To some degree upon native oral traditions, which she was very familiar with. Again, she and I, looked at Heidenreich's work, and we concurred with him that the route that Heidenreich had laid out was the best possible route, given the information. But then, based upon oral traditions and the French sources, Nancy said, I think the most likely place that Nicolet went was Marinette. And again, she was pretty certain it was 1634. I said, no, Nancy, it could just as easily have been 1633. She didn't really want to state that, in the core agenda. She was certain it was 1634. But in my own book, when I decided to kind of update it a bit, I made the possibility of 1633, put that in there. My big contribution, though, is, and Heidenreich's work was also part of this, he didn't go anywhere into Lake Superior. Absolutely did not. And again, it was just, if you read the Jung in Vermont carefully, if you understand what they're describing, if you use Heidenreich's work and his interpretation of the cartography of Champlain, it is 100% certain. That's another set of wrong answers. Anybody who said that Nicolet went to Winnebago Lake, Nipigon, Quamagon Bay, or Keweenaw, they're wrong. That's easy. It's really easy to eliminate that as a wrong answer. There's this guy in Chicago who's convinced Nicolet went to Chicago. That's another very easily dismissed answer. Okay? And of course, he lives in Chicago. He's written a history of Chicago, and that's where he wants the first white man to go. I told him that, and he hung up the phone on me. It was not a pleasant conversation. But here's the big thing. How many of you heard something about Nicolet maybe when you were growing up? Or okay? How many of you were told that he was looking for China? He had that Chinese robe? Absolutely wrong. This was Nancy's big contribution. This just shows how, again, you're dealing with sources that are 100, 200 years old, at least the early researchers were, and they didn't really understand what they were reading. They did the best job they could. They made a mistake. The Chinese robe. He did not wear a Chinese robe. Absolutely fallacious. Okay, Nancy figured this one out, and she was brilliant for doing so. This is the mont's description of what Nicolet wore on his journey. I don't read French very well, or speak French very well. I'll translate here. A grand robe of China damask, all strewn with flowers and birds of many colors. Well, the earliest writers, like Benjamin Sulte, said, oh, he was wearing a Chinese robe. Why would he do that? Oh, he must have thought he was going to China. And he was the first one to write it, and I can see why he made the mistake he did. It wasn't intentional. He connected a lot of dots that shouldn't have been connected. But once he wrote that, it was repeated over and over and over and over. China damask does not denote a style of robe. It was a type of silk. And Nancy did thorough research into the French silk making industry during Nicolet's time. They made lots of China damask. China damask was a type of silk that had the pattern integral to the weave. She was a lot better at French than I was. She found out that the word robe in 17th century French could mean a robe, but it could also mean a cape. It had two different meanings to it. Well, Benjamin Sulte didn't know any of this, so he did the best he could. Well, it's the reason that when you look at all these paintings of Nicolet, he's wearing a Chinese robe. And he looks like some ridiculous, dumb, medieval European looking for China and dressed like a Chinese person, like he's going to meet mandarins from China, the Ming Dynasty. And why the hell he would wear a Chinese robe? He's a European. He looks like one. He's got a beard. Why would he even do that? Well, they didn't have, no historian had ever really figured that out until Nancy Lurie figured it out. This is what he was actually wearing. A typical French cape made of silk that was common outerwear for people who had rank. Nicolet was not a nobleman. He was a member of the bourgeoisie, which was sort of one step below the nobility. But many of them, as a French bourgeois, as a translator, as a literate, educated Frenchman, he would have dressed to his station, especially when he was on diplomacy with Indians. So again, we see birds and flowers and everything else. This is what Nicolet was actually wearing, a typical piece of French outerwear made from silk that we know was made in France at the time. So Nancy figured that out. She said, okay, Nicolet was not looking for China. Again, I went through all of Champlain's writings. He never believed that China lay west of Lake Huron. Never believed that. It was a long, long way to the Pacific Ocean from where he was. There's never that geographic naive. But once she figured that out, okay, if he's not looking for China, then why is he going there? Well, then his mission was purely diplomatic. He was there to negotiate a treaty of peace between the tribes of Green Bay and the tribes of the Huron, Lake Huron Basin. Now, the Jesuits even said that. It was later historians who inserted this whole ridiculous story of a Chinese robe and looking for China. It's just been repeated over and over. The historical marker here by the statue, it still says that. I've been trying to get the State Historical Society to change it for years now. And plus, it calls the Chinese people Asiatics. I said, look, that's not even, that's borderline racist there. I mean, the historical marker is in dire need of being of an update, to say the least. But undoing this myth has been quite difficult, to say the least. Let me just make sure I know what slide I'm on here. Okay, number 12. Okay. Undoing this Chinese myth has been very difficult. As I said, it was first proposed in the 1870s by a French-Canadian historian. It was repeated over and over and over. And ultimately, it was just kind of took on a life of its own. And Nancy Lurie was the first one to kind of question the whole thing, and to basically correct a historical error, which is common. There's errors in the historical record, but it's one of those things that's today dying kind of slowly. So, what contributions did I make? Well, this is where I came to disagree with Nancy, and this is where my ongoing research is now. This might take another year to 5 years, depending on all sorts of things in my personal life and my teaching schedule and everything else. First of all, discounting Lake Superior. I found a crucial underfind in I think it's Lejeune's writings. I bounced that against the work of Heidenreich, and it's clear he never went to Lake Superior. That's 100%. But who did Nicolet go to meet? First of all, in the 20th century, historians were really keen to know who was the first white man in Wisconsin. That is a 20th century question. We have moved far beyond that. My answer is, who cares? Yeah, the first white man in Wisconsin met people who had been here for 10,000 years already. More important, who was the first human being here in Wisconsin? I'd love to know that. I doubt we'll ever find it. So my big question is, okay, Nicolet is sent on a diplomatic voyage. I buy everything Nancy said. Who was he meeting? We know the Indians he lived among. He lived among the Hurons and the associated tribes of Lake Huron. We know a lot about them. The French described the people of Green Bay as the Puans. Almost certainly these were the ancestors of the Ho-Chunk people, but they did call themselves Ho-Chunk at the time. We don't know what they called themselves. I use the word Puan only because it's the only word we have. The word Ho-Chunk doesn't really come into general use among the Ho-Chunk till probably the 1690s, maybe even later than that. Again, the sources are really vague, to say the least. And I've had this conversation with a lot of archaeologists. I tell them, gotta quit calling the people Nicolet meant the Ho-Chunk or the Winnebago, which is their older name. They didn't use the word Ho-Chunk yet. It's clear that they did. Nancy wasn't sure when they started using it, but the earliest reference I found to it is 1721. There's nothing before that. Nancy believed that the ancestors of the Ho-Chunk all lived around Red Banks. Now, she didn't believe Nicolet went there, but she believed that this is where all the ancestors of the Ho-Chunk lived. And I was engaged with a couple other archaeologists while we were writing. They said, nope, Nancy is wrong. There's no way that little area could have supported 20,000 people. And we know from the French sources that that's how many people one had. So it took me many years of talking with archaeologists, but this is my own current theory, and I might be wrong, but based upon the archaeology, the French sources, and oral traditions, most likely the Puan, the ancestors of the Ho-Chunk, lived all the way up here in Sturgeon Bay in villages that stretched all the way down to the Middle Fox River, possibly all the way to the Portage, maybe even to the Mississippi. This would have been like an Indian empire here in Wisconsin. And my next job is to go through every known piece of Ho-Chunk oral tradition, folk tales, oral histories, etc., to see if I can't tease some details out of that. I mean, I'm working with an archaeologist down in Illinois who did similar work, and his work was really promising, and he seems to think that I might find the answer, the right answer in the oral tradition. We also know for a fact that this polity, this empire of 20,000 Puan Indians, was attacked by the war parties of the Illinois Confederacy probably about 10 years after Nicolet made his visit. So this very populous society of corn-growing Puan were, they suffered a 96% population loss, according to the French. The Ho-Chunk people will emerge from the remnants of the Puan people, and they will develop a very different social structure, a different clan structure. And again, even then, I'm not the first one to say that. There, one of Nancy's predecessors, earlier anthropologists, had a very similar theory. So I'm trying to build on that a bit. But this would have been basically a huge number of people. And we know that there were similar societies farther east, like the Hurons, the Iroquois, the Powhatan. So this was not unusual in North America. I simply tend to think that we know more about those other societies just because we have more documentation. I'm willing to bet that with the right archaeology and the right understanding of the oral traditions, we can piece together, at least partially, what this society looked like that Nicolet met. And again, we know that the Ho-Chunk emerged from the remnants of this population that was destroyed by war parties of the Illinois Confederacy. Probably like a 96% death rate. And understand this is not something that people are often comfortable recognizing. American Indians practiced genocide. They figured the best way to deal with their enemies was to destroy them, root, branch, and trunk. Okay? The Iroquois wiped out several tribes, like the Theory and the Neutral, who simply ceased to exist. And the Illinois Confederacy came pretty close with destroying the Yukon. And it would be a long time until the Ho-Chunk could rise up out of it. Now, to kind of finish up here with Nicolet, here's a fun little clip I'd love to show. It's got over a dozen historical inaccuracies in it. It's fun to watch. I let smile every time I watch it.
When I finish passing through this wilderness and reach China, I shall greet them wearing this.
Sir Nicolet, your mission shall be for the honor of the king and the holy faith.
In the summer of 1634, Jean Nicolet set off back to find a trade route that would link Europe and North America to China. Where is it?
Father, I know the place you are seeking.
For months, Nicolet pushed through the wilderness, searching for the Western Sea.
Boya, Mississippi!
What did he say?
He says, Mississippi, great water.
Sea, China. Jean Nicolet was wrong. It was Lake Michigan, not the Pacific. But others would follow his dream. Joliet, LaSalle, the La Vérendryes, and they would map most of North America, probably to the Gulf of Mexico.
There's at least a dozen areas in that thing. Let me kind of talk a little bit about Marquette, a little bit more about the native people, and then I'd like to take some questions. Nicolet was the first Frenchman here in the Western Great Lakes. We know a lot more about the Frenchmen who came later, a whole lot more. Again, the relations of the Jesuits are absolutely critical to this process. And, within, 40 years of his voyage, 30 or 40 years of his voyage, the French were setting up trading posts in the Western Great Lakes. They were setting up Jesuit missions. And we know a whole lot more about that period that came later. But we know very little about the period of Nicolet. We know that the human geography, particularly here in northeastern Wisconsin, was very different when the Jesuits finally established permanent missions here in the 1660s. And the Jesuits even say that in their writings, just not to the degree I would like them to have said it. As far as Marquette, just to kind of as a counterpoint, we know what Marquette looked like. There's a painting of him. Not the best shape, I'll grant, but we actually have a painting of what he looked like. We know that he made 2 voyages. His more famous voyage was in 1673, and he went all the way down to the Arkansas River in Louis Joliet, became the first Frenchman to see the Mississippi. In his 1674 voyage, which was probably more important to him, because he went down to the Illinois River among the Illinois Indians and established a religious mission among them. That's well detailed. You can date his entire trip down the western shore of Lake Michigan, to include here in Sturgeon Bay. Okay, we know a tremendous amount more about Jacques Marquette, and again, this is just the way our understanding of the past is. We have more documentation, we have more answers, we know what he looked like. It's a completely different ballgame. Someone like Jean Nicolet. I also like to point out some of the research that I've been doing here with the museum. Brennan and I have had some really good conversations about this man, John Holland, who wrote. He was a pretty extensive writer of Door County history. Has anybody ever seen his works? Yeah, Kelmar Holland was typical of a lot of early historical researchers. He wasn't trained in historical research. He wasn't bad, but he didn't use sources very critically. He would sometimes pull together sources from different time periods that weren't about the same events that he thought. And typical of a lot of writers, he wrote for the pleasure of doing it, researched for the pleasure of doing it. He got a lot of stuff right. He also got a lot of stuff wrong. Okay, And right now, Brennan and I have been talking about the origin of the name Death's Door. I mean, we've heard of Death's Door, okay? They say I did some of the research. I let Brennan pick up the ball now. He's going to be the expert on Death's Door by the time he's done writing this article. But Hjalmar Holland made some mistakes, all right? It's true that a lot of ships get shipwrecked here at Port de Mors Passage or Death's Door. Hjalmar Holland got that right. But the story of when it got its name, that's kind of a, that's kind of a difficult thing to figure out. I'm not going to talk too much more about it because I just got done reading Brennan's paper on the subject.
It'll be for next month's speaker
I want
series.
him to give a talk on Death's Door, so that'll be he's going to be the expert by the time we're done. I do like to point this out: the Puan, the ancestors of the Ho-Chunk, they were definitely resident here when Nicolet arrived. Again, 96% about most likely were killed by the Illinois Confederacy. What happens in the 1640s to the 1660s? I mentioned the Iroquois. They launch a series of wars in the eastern Great Lakes that they later extend into the western Great Lakes. And this is what's going to disrupt the human geography of the Great Lakes for generations. This all happened after Nicolet. It's one of the reasons we have problems figuring out what things look like when Nicolet went westward. The human geography of the area changed within a decade. Okay? And the Potawatomi, the Huron originally lived in Lake Huron. The Potawatomi originally lived in the lower peninsula of Michigan. All right. They would be some of the tribes who would be thrown and thrust westward into Wisconsin. So that's why they call those the Potawatomi Islands. When the French actually came here to set up permanent mission stations, the Potawatomis are here, the Sauk's are here, all these tribes from southern Michigan. And the original two resident tribes, the Menominee and the Puans, who are now beginning to call themselves the Ho-Chunk, well, they were just decimated by these earlier wars with Illinois. So this is what the native villages of northeastern Wisconsin looked like about 1725. Okay, and you can see the Potawatomis from the lower peninsula. They will become the new resident tribe here. Will replace the Ho-Chunk. The ancestors, the Ho-Chunk, are now going to live mostly around Lake Winnebago. That's where the lake gets its name. The older name of the Ho-Chunk, Winnebago. And they spoke a very different language than the people like the Potawatomis. And ultimately, the Potawatomis themselves will begin to migrate down the western shore of Lake Michigan, toward Manitowoc, Sheboygan, Milwaukee, Chicago, all of which have Potawatomi names, all of them, all right? And so by the time we move a century forward from there, the Potawatomis have largely left the area, and they are going to be replaced mostly by Ojibwa speakers. But there's a lot of mixed villages. You probably noticed that there's a lot more village sites a century later. The Indians of the Western Great Lakes had a population boom from like early 1700s to about the early 1800s. And there were just a lot more village sites. But the Potawatomis begin to migrate down the western shore of Lake Michigan. And what we see are a lot of mixed villages on the Door Peninsula. Menominee, Ojibwa villages, Ojibwa, Potawatomi, Ottawa, and they all spoke very similar languages. So they were able to communicate, especially Ojibwa, Potawatomi, and Ottawa. They all speak dialects of the exact same language. Menominee is fairly different from those three dialects, but a lot of people who spoke Menominee also spoke Ojibwa or Ottawa as sort of a second language. They were similar enough. So this is what this is probably a great book or a great dissertation for some young budding scholar, just to talk about the changing natives history of the Door Peninsula from Nicolet to say 1830. And this is about the time the federal government begins to force the American Indians to sell their land. So one of the last pictures I want to show you here, these are the Indian land cessions of northern Wisconsin. And just to kind of give you the details here, there was this guy named Royce who looked at all the treaties and all the Indian land sales, and he put them on maps, and we call these Royce areas. So as you can see, everything from the tip of Door County all the way down to, Milwaukee, that was part of Royce Area 160. And that was purchased by the federal government in 1831. The Menominee claimed ownership of it, and they sold it to the United States. They received $8,000 in clothing, $1,000 in flour, $1,000 in cash, and $6,000 a year in cash for the next 12 years. And with that, basically the native history of the Door County Peninsula and Sturgeon Bay ends. The kids are all forced to leave and go to some of the reservations here in North Woods. Many of the Potawatomis are forced to go into Iowa. And that's kind of a real condensed version of the very long set of native histories. But at this point, as I said, I only like to go for about 45 minutes or so at the most. What questions do you have? I can also go back to some of the pictures too. Yes, Brett.
We have two from online from Stephen Johnson. He's wondering, is the Le Bay du Point relate to the term Puans?
The what?
The original term for Green Bay, the Bay du Point, is
Yes,
that
it
related
is,
to the Puans?
Yeah, the French called the ancestors of the Ho-Chunk the Puan, and they lived at the bay. Yes, this was their bay, and they were called the Puan. It was actually short for in French. It means the exact same thing as Winnebago does in Algonquin. Basically, the gens de l'eau Puan, people of the stinky water. Because Green Bay, as you might know, has quite the odor to it. That's what they were called, people of the smelly water. And the French just kind of used the clip version of that for Puan.
And one other one, is Rock Island considered part of the Potawatomi Islands?
Yes, it is. And again, there was an archaeologist, Ron Mason, who wrote a very convincing case for the fact that the French explorer La Salle came several generations after Nicolet. That's where he went. So yes, those are all called the Potawatomi Islands because that's what the French call them. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Where did the Oneidas fall in?
Well, the Oneidas lived in New York. They were going back here. The Oneidas, they were part of the Iroquois Federation. But in the 1820s, the United States was really eager to get all of the Iroquois tribes out of New York, settled them farther west. Wisconsin was originally supposed to be a big Indian reservation, but they could only convince the Oneidas to move, and only part of the Oneidas, and some other tribes who had settled in New York with the Oneidas. But that was much later. That was like the 1820s. And by the time the federal government started buying up land, you can see here, part of what they did was just secure some, secure some of the old Menominee land for the Oneidas. But that was much later. They were Iroquois tribe. They were Iroquois tribe. Question. Yes, sir.
Are the archaeologists able to trace the heritage of the Ho-Chunks to the Puans by the pottery or what?
There's a lot of things. Pottery. It's not just pottery. It's kind of marrying up the French sources with the artifacts. Long story short, no archaeologist is going to tell you they're 100% sure that the stuff they find in the ground was the ancestors of the Ho-Chunk. But then they'll say, but it's almost 100%. It goes a little bit. There's some of the Iowa were another tribe who lived along the Mississippi. They spoke a language almost identical to the Ho-Chunk, and there they've been able to tie definitively the artifacts along the Mississippi to the Iowans. And those artifacts look very similar to what they find at Lake Winnebago and Green Bay. It's one of those things where they're not 100% sure, but they'll tell you, yeah, we're 99.9%. The short answer is they couldn't be at the artifacts couldn't have belonged to anybody else but them, unless aliens brought some civilization down here from space, switched them all out around the time of Nicolet. So that's one of the, but artifacts tell a very different story. But yeah, every archaeologist I've talked to, they are confident that the people who the French call the Puan, those are the latest artifacts we find in the ground here in northern Wisconsin. I'll try to keep my answers short and sweet here. Anybody else have a question? Yes, sir.
Where do you get the 20,000?
Well, the one French chronicler, Nicolas Perrault, he wrote more about the Puans than any other Frenchman. He wrote about them, and he was a resident at Green Bay in like the 1670s and 80s. Wrote about Puans then. He also wrote about their earlier history before he had arrived. And he said at their height they had between 6,000 to 7,000 warriors. That's men. Standard formula that the historians use to figure out total population, because a lot of times in the early records they just list the number of warriors. To assume 4 women, children, elderly people for every adult male warrior. So that gives you an estimate of between 20 to 25,000 people. If Perrault is correct, and the archaeology does support that, look at all the archaeological sites that stretch from Sturgeon Bay all the right way down to Lake Winnebago, those sites would have supported a population of about 20,000. It's like what Perrault mentioned. So that's a good example of how the archaeology is very much in line with what the French sources say. What else have any questions?
So how did the Jesuits get involved with coming over to North America? The Pope?
No, Champlain was, he was a devoutly Roman Catholic. This is a very religious time. Just the only people who did bring missionaries were the English. They brought their own preachers, but they didn't bring missionaries from the Indians, although some of them did preach. This is in the post-Protestant Reformation era. Catholic Church is going through the Catholic Counter-Reformation. It's a deeply religious time, and there was just this moral imperative to convert the Indians to Christianity. Spanish did it, French did it, and Champlain thought that the Jesuits would be the best people for it because they had the most training. They worked in China, India, so that was most of Champlain's story. Oh, Brendan.
Oh, we have another question here from John Foote. It says that he read that Nicolet stopped at a native village across from Red Banks near modern day Oconto. Is that accurate?
No.
Okay.
No. The short answer is whoever wrote that is guessing.
Okay.
He might have, maybe, but to say 100% dyed in the wool fact, no. He might have gone to it's a maybe at best, but it's not a 100% guaranteed fact. We don't know 100% where he went. Marinette is the best answer that, after years of thinking about it, Nancy Dory could come up with, and I still agree. That was the largest Menominee village. He might have gone to Oconto, but I doubt it. It's too far south. Anyway, I thought I saw a hand. Yes, sir.
I guess I have some questions about it. Some are nations, some are tribes, some are clans. I mean,
Okay.
is it a tribe a subdivision of a nation? And
No, I tend to use the terms. First of all, tribe is basically a single group of people with a common language and everything else. Historians and anthropologists, I'm trying to find a map here. Trying to find the map on here. This will work just as well. Increasingly, the word tribe and nation are essentially the same thing. They're synonymous. Clans are divisions within a tribe. Okay, so you would have the Menominee tribe or the Menominee nation. Scholars today are using nation because they just feel more comfortable with it, to be honest with you. But within any Indian nation or tribe, again, think of those two words as synonymous. You're going to have multiple clans. When you're born into a clan, it's kind of like a last name, and you have to marry somebody in another. And all the tribes here had different clans. You inherited your clan identity from your father. The Ho-Chunk had 12 clans, like how many of them?
well, like the Native Americans out west, the Arapahoes and the Comanches, and all that, I mean, are they from a different nation or tribe?
Oh, those are different, yeah, in different tribes or nations. Increasingly, just because the Indians of Canada call themselves nations rather than tribes, a lot of American tribes are now calling themselves nations rather than tribes. It's it's just kind of a new preferred use to call everyone who speaks Arapaho has Arapaho ancestry, members of the Arapaho nation, but they're separate from other Indian nations like the Menominee, the Ho-Chunk region. And clans are subdivisions and nation. The other question. There's another one online.
Yeah, one from James Carnes. He says, "How large were Native American families?" I think you touched on this briefly with the.
Well, they, they had nuclear families. Generally, they didn't have as many kids as you would think. They tended to spread their children out over long periods of time. I would say, I know that like Black Hawk, who I've read the most about, he had what I think 2 sons and a daughter. Honestly, from every description I've read of nuclear families, they were about the size of contemporary families. They tended to not have a lot of kids, and that's because they like to space them out. And Indian men also abstained from sexual intercourse because they thought it weakened them as men. Sometimes they would go 2 or 3 years without sexual intercourse because they thought it drained them of their power as a warrior. So Indian women tended to be more sexually aggressive than Indian men, which is kind of the opposite. Indian man was considered more manly if you go without sex for a year, 2 years. So that tended to limit family size. Other questions? Any more online? We are at just about 8 o'clock, and again, I don't like to go on for too long. But if anybody wants to hang around for a little bit after this, I'll be more than happy to take one-on-one questions. Thank you everyone for showing up. It was a lot of fun being here.